Great. Welcome everybody in the room and online to today's Faces of the City seminar, which is actually the last seminar of our series, but not the last event. We'll talk more about that at the end. But welcome. The title of today's Faces of the City seminar is Spatial Imaginaries, Lived Alternatives, Reimagined Housing Futures versus Planned Projects. Just to introduce myself, I'm Stjwetla Gonzalez. I'm from the Geography Department here at Wits, but I'm part of Cubes and part of the City Studio team. In case you don't know what the City Studio is, the City Studio critically engages the enduring and deepening South African challenges of urban inequality and spatial injustice, seeking to understand their reproduction and intensification and collaboratively search for ways to change discourse. And the City Studio at the moment, between 2024 and 2026, focuses on a 1 to 3 kilometer radius around the Marlborough Gautrain station, which is 20 kilometers northeast of the Johannesburg CBD. So the work that we've been doing in this seminar series has really been around the engaged research and pedagogy of the Calvin Alexander Frankenwald City Studio. So thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We've had quite a vibrant and engaged set of seminars, so we really appreciate those of you we see, those of you who've been here consistently week on week, so thank you in the room and online. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers for today and just remind you that the session will be focusing on the alternative making of housing and urban neighborhoods that is represented by the tightly built up fabric of Stjwetla, a lived response to spatial and economic inequality. It extracts transformative design, layout, and typological principles that propose a future built on lived but constrained resilience and ingenuity. This exposes an inherent lived critique of the assumptions underpinning conventional planned housing and mixed-use projects. It also provokes a profound reassessment of the post-apartheid urban development path. So the three speakers that we're going to be having presenting for us today are Nomonde Gwebu, who is a practicing architect, lecturer, and researcher in the School of Architecture and Planning here at Wits. Through the application of design atelier to case studies, her research employs architectural design as a tool to contribute constructively to the discourse of low-cost housing in South Africa. Next, we have Marie Huchzermeyer, who's a professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits and is also director of Cubes. She currently leads the Calvin Alexander Frankenwald City Studio. Marie's research is on informal settlement, housing policy, the right to the city, and spatial justice. Her writing has spanned South Africa, Brazil, Germany, Kenya, and other African countries. Finally, among our speakers, we have Quentin Rihoux, who holds a degree in architecture, planning, and urban policies, a PhD candidate in urban geography at the University of Lausanne, and intern at Cubes. At the intersection of political and economy and cultural theory, Quentin studies the worldwide shift in urban planning and development discourse from plan to project, and the spatial implications for urban politics in Paris and Johannesburg. Finally, our two respondents for today, both of whom we're very excited to hear from, is Irene Molina, who is a professor in human geography and the coordinator of the research group Housing and Urban Justice at the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Uppsala University. Her main areas of interest are the dynamics of racialization and urban segregation and the intersections between racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Also joining us as a respondent today is Msizi Khuhlane, who has a background in social housing, serves in the Intergovernmental Relation Unit of the Human Settlements Department at the City of Johannesburg. He previously worked on the inner city housing challenges, including responses to inner city housing implementation plans in the city's Human Settlements Department. He has also served in the research and policy development. Thanks. So without further ado, let's start off. We're actually going to start off with Marie. Each of the presenters, please try and keep to time. You'll have 15 minutes each, and I will be timing you and give you a heads up. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Rita. And yes, here I have two images of Stjwetla. On the left, a very familiar aerial photograph of this large swathe of informal housing that is sort of spread into the interstices. All the available land is really covered, and you know, evictions and other barriers have pushed back to kind of a size that's been stable now for the last few years. Quentin a little later will talk more about how Stjwetla sits within the broader context and development that's happening directly north of it, on a greenfield site. I'm going to focus more on Stjwetla. Nomonde is going to zoom in and specifically talk about her research that has extrapolated design principles out of, but I'll get to housing as well, to that scale of things, and Nomonde will take over from there. I just wanted to acknowledge that Quentin and I put our heads together, and some of that, or basically a lot of what I'm saying, came out of this conversation together, and I need to acknowledge Quentin in this. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a map, which we'll zoom into just now, which shows all the different place names in Stjwetla. And looking at Stjwetla through its place names starts changing the picture about what this place is. It's got one identity as Stjwetla, but it has many sub-areas with intricate naming and different typologies, and it's a highly complex and diverse settlement. Here we have, on the left, I'm just showing three areas that we'll zoom in a bit. In the north, Makonyane village, which is one of the recent extension of Stjwetla, in fact, an occupation that happened not long ago. And in the south, Masingeni is a separate area that was a temporary location area, a resettlement area, as people call it themselves, but essentially it's part of the informal settlement, and was part of the informal settlement before it was cleared. And then on the far right, Sitchoba is another portion that evolved in a more haphazard and very rapid way. And the image, the aerial photograph that you see here shows on the right-hand side a part of Sitchoba. What you see there is a very dense occupation and very few roads, in fact, no roads leading into it. Access is entirely through something that locally is called a passage, a very narrow alleyway. And that's a feature that we'll try and unpack a little bit as a structuring feature of this built environment. What I'm showing you next is a World Heritage Site, UNESCO World Heritage Site, Lamu in Kenya, a town that was built in the 14th century, but already occupied in the 12th century. And if you look closely at this aerial photograph, you'll see that there are also no roads. Lamu is a pedestrian city, in fact, prides itself on only having one motor car, which belongs to the vet who looks after the donkeys. It's changing rapidly due to a corridor being built now between Lamu and the internal territory. But the point I'm trying to make by putting Lamu here is that there are passages, and passages in Lamu are, as you see on the left-hand side, something that can get rather narrow. And there's points where only one person passes in a passage at a time, but it is accepted and it's intricate and it's protected by UNESCO. And it's protected for a reason, and that is that colonial planning and post-colonial planning does not value or legitimize environments like this. And so if we then turn, so just to perhaps dwell a little bit longer on this on the passageways, the fact that you can't necessarily see what's at the other end, that there's an open water gully in the passageway, but people have lived like this and are used to living like this, and there's an integrity to this kind of environment. So turning back to Stjwetla then, I'm just showing a few little images here of the very narrow alleyways, which to varying extent, have little water gullies in them. Mostly they are paved. There've been localized ways of dealing with stormwater and other, and it's in fact a topic of one of our master's students this year. But these alleyways are also in other parts of Stjwetla, and on the aerial photograph you would have seen this very dense, large swathes of Stjwetla being very dense and passageways like this in existence. So the built-up fabric of Stjwetla is very dense. But it's also diverse, and there is precarious housing in Stjwetla, although it is also inhabited by people that are not just surviving, that have a modest income and are able to invest quite innovatively in the very little space that they manage to secure. Stjwetla is not socioeconomically segregated internally, but nevertheless, the more marginal people occupy, or the more socioeconomically marginalized people occupy the more marginal land, and you'd find exactly the same pattern in a favela in Brazil, that over time, the people that arrived more recently are the more precarious ones that have to occupy the steep slopes or in Stjwetla, the areas that are more likely to be flooded. But different parts of Stjwetla also have different, evolved out of different city-making processes. Also in terms, so in those different spatial arrangements then are different kinds of compromises, but also qualities. So one of the other qualities that I wanted to mention, in a way, the passageways are a quality, but they're also a real compromise. And in Stjwetla, people manage those compromises, and that one person stands back and lets the other person pass through. There's a politeness that goes with navigating these spaces. But here we have from Lamo a feature, which is a bench built onto the side of a house, and it also becomes a feature internally or in the in-between spaces between public and private. And this is a feature that we see very extensively across Stjwetla, and it's almost a unifying feature that across the different typologies of housing and of city making across the entire Stjwetla. So tin houses would have them, or corrugated iron houses would have them in front of them. The unifying feature also being the red polished paint that is sold at the market, and that is really a lot of effort gets put into keeping these little stoops beautifully polished, and they're used for a diversity of purposes. So there's one that's tiled in front of a very beautiful little house, and on the right-hand side, a more precarious one, but that's where the shoes get left when you step inside, or in the one case below, a sort of traditional habit that's being dried. So there's often one sees washing tubs standing on these stoops as well. They define a semi-private space. And the temporary location area in Stjwetla also people have also appropriated these sort of concrete structures in front of their houses and used the same color, and it becomes really a unifying feature across the entire settlement. Okay, well, I'll then I was mentioning different parts of Stjwetla. Masengeni in the south is a response to infrastructure that was laid out. In fact, it was electricity. There's no other infrastructure other than electricity that was laid in a grid system with long straight blocks and temporary shelters, very, very small dimension, one room temporary shelters. And that was the pattern according to which people were allocated units, and which has since then transformed. There are some internal bathrooms and sewers that have been built, and others are still using the communal chemical toilets that are rolled up along the main road and collected water. Maponyane village, which is up in the north, is in turn is a collectively conceived and considered occupation, and it's specifically structured by it's very well thought through system of access. And Mike Tabulo, who's in the room with us, was one of the people that was involved in that occupation, which had to be repeated at least 3 times because it was demolished again and again. But the occupation was in brick and not in temporary materials, which is quite remarkable and unique in South Africa. And then I'd already mentioned Stjwetla, which really was a rapid and undirected occupation, and not guided at all by pre-existing infrastructure. And in response to flood victims needing to be formally relocated, and then other people just joining that occupation in quite a rapid fashion. And yes, so the passage 5 more minutes. Oh, okay. I'm gonna move on. Yes, so in this conversation between Quentin and I, we talked about how Fanon talks about the Medinas and Algiers, which would be a similar pattern of very narrow alleyways, and how that they were surrounded by the European city and control, you know, and there was no escape during colonialism out of the Medina. And in a way, history was stopped in the Medina, and modernity was kind of evolving around on the outside of it. And in a way, we don't really see Stjwetla as that at all, but rather we see Alexandra, the township to the south of Stjwetla, as that, and as people having broken out of those confines to occupy, and in particular to occupy Maponyane village in a new vision and a different way and in a way that ruptured the way the state had intended them to live. Sorry. So nevertheless, so Fanon on the one hand was critiquing the Medina and the very confined spaces that people had there, but at the same time was also pointing out that there was a connectivism in the living there as opposed to the individualized life that was promoted, you know, in the colonial town, and so we also look at all of Stjwetla, but specifically Maponyane village and the way it was developed as something that is a collective way of city making and a collective living together. So what I'd like to do now in the remaining time is talk a little bit about the voice from below of living in these environments. So this is now from Masengeni. The image on the right-hand side was actually given through a photo voice methodology where we had during our mapping workshop in September, and the participant asked me to photograph this image, and when asked where people rest, a lot of people were in this methodology. A lot of people were saying that they can only really rest inside their rooms. They really appreciate the private space, which in most instances is self-created. But the person I was interviewing here was saying, I feel comfortable in my warmly home, a home that has love. I have created that here, and one creates one's own happiness. And then she elaborated on how this sort of family self-created home means happiness to them. She was saying a happy home does not have a time frame. Things change all the time. I might feel comfortable with what I have, then I don't like the paint anymore, and I buy a 5 liter and change it. And Another resident occupying a different part of Stjwetla, a bit different part of this part of Stjwetla, was saying, we started living here. When we started living here, you saw shacks. After that, I started to build slow by slow, no plan, just me. I designed it myself, piece by piece. All this house is me, to design everything. I'm a builder, plumber, tiling, welding, everything. Pavement, yes, ceiling. To put in electricity wiring was me, but to connect was not me. This house is not a business. I want to build upstairs. We have a child. I want the girl downstairs, the boy upstairs. The stairs are already built. And when asked about what gave them the confidence to invest, the previous respondent said, this is a resettlement area, therefore we can do what we have with the little space we got here. So there is a sense of security of tenure because it was allocated, although in the mind of the government it is a temporary relocation area. There was also great care in Nomonde Gwebu's response about the public space. So we see this paving here, and he proudly said, and allowed us to share his name. I did the paving outside. Before that, I was seeing the mud when it was raining. I don't want the mud inside my house. Also, when you want to park a car, and if my kids want to play, they must play on paving. That's why I paved. Only me did the paving, slow by slow. If people want to do paving, I do that job. I have done it in Stjwetla, also steps, and here's an example of well-designed steps in the street, in the next street. I do building work in Stjwetla, but only a few houses. Most of my work is outside of Stjwetla. In this case, the respondent was a little bit uncomfortable with the public space, arguing or saying that what I'm seeing, we were commenting on the picture that we've taken in the photo voice. What I'm seeing is a picture of lack of space. I see a door. I can see a door. I can see stairs. I can see stairs close by because I can see a door here, a road there. There's no space. We are just managing with what we have. But at the same time, she also said having people around. She basically explained what made her feel uncomfortable here. She was saying having people around the street all the time, having people passing by anytime, all the hours, people talking. You never know who's genuine, who's not. There's no yard, there's no public space. It's only public space. Your only private space is if you move inside your house. But at the same time, she commented, because people around here have understanding of one another, most of them, no one is fussy if you sit outside their house. And here she was commenting on the fact that a lot of people have these benches outside their house, and you can basically sit outside someone else's house. Yes. So there was another respondent in Kona Park, which is just downstream of Masengeni. His husband had built a 2-story house, and she made the comment that I like the whole of Stjwetla. It's safe, very, very comfortable. Us neighbors, close to one another. If something happens, I can hear. It's a very good thing. And unlike Solomon, who expressly stated that his house is not a business, Dora explained about this house. We're proud because this house really made us buy bread, food for the children, clothes. It's a business. So their house has 2 rental units, and they occupy the bit at the bottom, the family, and they enter through the garage door. Yes. Okay. So what I very briefly at the end like to just give another example of our photo voice in Makonyana village, and one participant pointed to the image at the top, saying how beautiful that passageway is, and in a way it kind of represents the careful thought that went into the making, the collective making of Laconia village. And the next participant actually walked with us to the street and made us take a photograph of the street at the bottom, saying this is a proper street. And again, also endorsing the kind of collective thought that went into this. So I think with that, I'd like to head over to Nomonde, whose research we'll hear about, which has really been building on the housing approach that's inherent in these areas. So thanks, Quentin.
Thank you so much, Marie. That is such a great background for where I'm going to enter. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, yes, we can. If we can just put it on presentation mode, then okay.
Okay, can you still see okay?
Yeah, that's fine, thanks.
Great, thank you. So I have presented previously this research, but I have done quite a lot of work since then. So sorry if there's some repetition for one or two of you who were there at the previous presentation. Okay, so it is on my PhD research, and it is called Housing Futures, an Ontology of Low-Cost Housing Design in South Africa by Case Study and Architectural Design Atelier. Housing refers here to the physical dwelling, the verb of containing or encompassing. Futures speaks about a time to come, alludes to a collective vision or reality. Atelier is applied in the study as a method and refers to a process of experimenting, workshopping, producing and evaluating versions of something that is to be implemented in the future. And ontology, the way it's used here, is used as in the term developed by Graham Harman. It's closely related to philosophy, where it's understood as the most fundamental level of analysis. Ontology deals with objects specifically, and the object of the study is, of course, low-cost housing. So I'll be taking you through the background of the research problem, the questions, the structure, and then I'll be going through the case studies. So please do note that I won't be doing all of the case studies that led to the design principles that I'm going to present. I'm only going to present the case studies that are within the City Studio area. I'm going to also leave out methodology, and I'm going to leave out the details on the conclusion because I really want to focus on the design principles because of the topic for today. Okay. So the first term the study develops is the term minimum logic. And that term really encapsulates the goal of the first model of housing that was proposed in South Africa. First, a minimum standard for native housing was developed by the South African government in the early 1950s during apartheid. And the housing that we then saw subsequent to that formal presentation of minimums that all housing, native housing should adhere to, the result of those of housing developed based on those minimums was minimum spatial footprint, which also led to minimum quality, to achieve an overall minimum expenditure. So this research develops minimum logic to define the ontology of that kind of a goal, which has, various expression, which we'll get into now. So on this minimum logic, the architectural design atelier methodology was actually used in 1953 by architect Douglas McGavin Calderwood. To produce what was then called the model native house. Interestingly, it's the same design that was then called the model native house, which is now which became the RDP house, and later was renamed as the BNG House, although it was under different policy eras. So Calderwood's thesis proposed the first comprehensively documented and widely implemented low-cost housing model in South Africa. That's why it is sort of the beginning of this research. And then just to clearly articulate what the research problem is, having presented this background, the problem is that while the urban and building designs of low-cost housing remained constant throughout different policy eras, the examples are photographed here, the aspirations that were in the policies that produced these designs actually had changing and at some moments contradictory aims. So, for example, the apartheid government was looking to contain and control a workforce with this design. The RDP House was looking to house a newly liberated population of South Africans in dignity, but used the same design to do so. And then in the BNG policy era, the aim of actually writing a new paper from a design point of view, the insights one can glean that are about design, were about correcting some of the shortcomings of the RDP. So while the policies had totally different objectives, the design that was expressed as a result of those policies saw very little change. And that is the problem of the research. So the question springing out of that problem, just to really simplify it for the purposes of this presentation, is why is it that the apartheid era housing models remained consistent or produced inferior products to the why is it that the apartheid era housing models either persisted or new housing programs produced units that were inferior to earlier native housing models? In other words, just to simplify it for the 15 minutes, how can we substantiate a design trajectory that achieves its aims and transcends the minimum logic? So I approach the question by these 4 sections: the background, a book chapter that just was really focused on the research question, on framing a background, and that's focusing on what is the influence of the 1950s model native house on contemporary low-cost housing. Then the first case study, atelier number 1, was in Eastern Johannesburg, not in the city studio area, so I won't present that in detail. But the second atelier case study is in Stjwetla, Evolving Architecture, Architectural Design Research towards evolving the temporary housing typology into permanent dwellings in Stjwetla. And then finally, the third atelier is in Frankenwald. That is called Urban Infill, articulating a spatial vision for inclusive human settlements in South Africa. I will also go through that in some detail. This is a model. It'll come up later. I'll just introduce it here. It's a model by Hamdi, and he basically uses this model to describe the way that low-cost housing is approached by various projects. And so he presents a dichotomy, really, in a nutshell, between providers where housing is implemented in quite a centralized kind of a way, or has very few players in the industry, and then supporters, and that refers to incremental types of development locally, that relies on local systems, local incomes, and typically takes the pace of however long it takes people to save up enough money to move forward. So what I've done in my research is adapted Hamdi's model from this dichotomy to a spectrum. And particularizing it to the South African context, I've taken the idea of providers and turned it into housing as an infrastructure. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, I have incremental housing. And that spectrum kind of enables us to discuss one approach to housing relative to another in a way that I will explain a little bit more later. Okay, so this is the first case study, the background that Marie furnished, perfect for this. I'm going to jump scale from where she was to this architectural scale. The photograph on the right, a typical example of the precarious conditions that Marie described. This is a typical self-built home, zinc sheeting and the plastic on the top are materials that we see in this kind of self-made typology. And then rather controversially, there's a relatively new temporary housing typology that is being implemented by the government in a very similar material, also zinc sheeting, and yes, materially very similar to the self-built models. Just to give you an idea of the scale, during 2022-2023, the Housing Development Agency awarded 4 separate tenders for the delivery of 1,256 units. So it's picking up during the period of this research, which was up to 2024, it was picking up quite steadily in its implementation. And I mentioned this temporary housing category because the state has delivered temporary housing in this case study to a community in Stjwetla where homes were actually burned down. That's commonly when temporary housing is delivered. Okay, so this is the study area for this particular research. Another view of what was delivered. The units are back to back. This is the street sort of formation that Marie presented. There are toilets here in this area which are shared, and they are between the community on the right and the cemetery that is on the left. This is a section through the site which sort of just reveals in diagrammatic form an elevation of what is delivered. And then these images kind of trace a path of how people upgrade their own dwellings. Starting on the left, the plinth that Marie presented from an architectural point of view, the waterproofing of the ground floor plane is something that is not done in the way that the temporary units are delivered. They're just sort of placed on top. So the first renovation tends to be fixing that. And then the middle image, we see kind of further upgrades, the painting that has been spoken about before. People really beautify and take pride in their homes. And then the sort of furthest, the renovations typically go on the right, the double story. So the research took quite a lot of time to document what the typical order of things is as people save up and are able to do more and more to the dwellings. Local construction workers often salvage materials from other projects, restore them, clean them, and then resell them to this market, and then they become affordable for people to actually implement these kinds of upgrades. And then as we saw also, but maybe in a bit more detail, that this is a typical kind of street where the various houses are in different stages of developing. Okay, so delivering a temporary house that must be demolished to make way for a long-term structure is unsustainable and impractical. So the research proposes that rather than delivering a temporary house, that what could be delivered could be a portion of a permanent house that would create more of an affordance for the kinds of dwellings that we know tend to come a few stages later. Okay. The second case study, second and last, that we'll be looking at here is on the vacant land, lucrative land between Alexandra or between Stjwetla and Sandton. So Sandton, one of South Africa's most expensive places. And that kind of tension, it's not really an exception anymore. It's something, you know, it's a reality that we're having to deal with more and more. This idea of the urban infill between, you know, contexts that have totally different social fabrics and income levels. So this atelier draws on 37 existing low-cost housing proposals developed for case studies throughout South Africa to propose a design for this greenfield site. The case study aims to locate similarities in approaches to low-cost housing in a set of national examples in order to propose ways, in order to propose a design that would then be theoretically widely applicable. So the site that is considered in this case study is what is outlined in blue. And then if we look at the next slide, there is a company that is working on developing the kind of the much larger piece of land. That's a developer that typically implements middle class and upper middle class dwellings, and they, you know, from the forms that we see here, those are the sorts of dwellings that they seem to be building here. They do claim to have thought about low costs to an extent, but the forms don't really show much variety in what they're going to present. So this research kind of assumes that a middle income development is on its way, and then looks at this lower piece of land that is owned by the state as an opportunity for an infill project between these extremes of underdevelopment and very developed suburbs that we are beginning to see. So all of the Master of Architecture theses that were generated between 2000 and 2024 were obtained by this research and tabulated in the way that you see here. And then Hamdi's model that I presented earlier was used to locate these approaches on a spectrum between approaching housing as an infrastructure and approaching housing incrementally in terms of what these designers through their research recommended as an approach for the context that they studied in a lot of detail. So for example, in the second column, you have UCT where there were 6 housing as infrastructure proposals, 1 incremental house design proposal, and 7 proposals that combined housing as infrastructure and incremental in the same project. Drawings were done to understand the essence of each proposal and kind of make their insights accessible as design strategies in order to be implemented on the vacant site. From all of these studies, this kind of design emerged. There's a rhythm here of private dwellings and businesses. The streets that we see in Stjwetla start to emerge in this design. And we kind of see echoes then of what Stjwetla, the character that Marie was describing about Stjwetla, but designed in a way that is a little bit less precarious, perhaps. So variety is attained through creating a fixed palette of design resolutions that owners can still select from. Sure, okay, time is really not on my side. I will go to the design principles then. So the design principles that were derived from this research that I've presented, a few other examples, and a couple of other findings from the literature review revealed these principles. Whether the approach was predominantly infrastructural or predominantly incremental, these 4 principles were still kind of visible in most of the recommendations and even in the proposals that the research produced. And that is like a visual rhythm modularity. And so there are brief explanations under each one, which I don't think we have time for, but the visual monotony that results from implementing identical structures arises from the practical need that mass producers must embed efficiency through repetition in their construction processes. While the conceptual approach of building communities through totally incremental, individually designed homes finds appeal with activists and community outsiders, community members tend to value the structural reliability of formally developed infrastructure housing projects. And then to account for the counter imperative for repetition and variety, the research finds potential in a rhythmed modularity. And then visual and functional variety, the variety and the function just being expressed in the design. Row housing was a strong kind of place where a lot of proposals landed as a need to densify, but not overly so. And then economic opportunity also came up strongly as something that is valued by people who actually live in some of these developments and across multiple contexts. Okay, and that sums up what I think there's time for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nomonde. So I'm going to try share my screen to continue.
Yes, let me unshare.
Okay, perfect. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So what I'm now going to do is to take the opposite view of what Marie and Nomonde presented, to present not the spatial imaginary of the inhabitants of Stjwetla or possible alternatives to what is being planned, but really the spatial imaginaries underlying the Frankenwald development project that Nomonde quickly mentioned. Meaning the set of ideas, images, and assumptions through which project managers, developers, planners, and experts of the Frankenwald development conceive and organize space. And I'll do so in three short parts. So I'll first talk about the spatial imaginary behind the objectives of the development, then behind the plan, which is the abstract space of the project, and then behind the plots, so a scale that allows to grasp more concretely what kind of material spaces it will result in. To do so, I need to start with a tiny bit of a history of the development. Because as some of you already know, it started at the end of apartheid, so about 30 years ago, as Wits University wanted to quickly sell the land for profit before potential land redistribution. And also after a long period of struggles against the apartheid planning throughout the 80s and beginning of the 90s, after which the ACO, so the civic organization of Alexandra, won some land concessions to extend Alex beyond the Far East Bank. So the Frankenwald estate became a sub-project of the Alex project in 1994 with the intention to turn this land into a low-cost housing development to de-densify Alex and create new jobs. The development process started. Wits University sold the land to state institutions, but the wealthier communities of Kelvin and Buccleuch attacked the transaction in court because they didn't want poor black people to settle next to their property, basically. And this marked the start of a series of failed development in Frankenwald. I don't have time to go through this, but just to say that the last development attempt was again attacked in court, this time by the developers of the Waterfall estate, to protect their commercial interests. And this started a 13 years land dispute. But in 2016, the development process restarted due to different conjunctural factors, which led Wits University to strategically hire a project manager to liquidate the land, and in practice to start a negotiation between 2016 and 2019 around development objectives through two main formats. A development committee with state authority like the HDA, GDHA, and the city planning department of Johannesburg, and workshops on the one hand with developers to choose two developers, and on the other with the communities of Buccleuch and Kelvin, which had previously opposed the project. The result of this negotiation is a set of, so these are not all the negotiations that happened, but the result of these negotiations contributed to a set of development objectives that try to position the development in continuity with previous development projects, while at the same time producing a maximum of profit, of surplus value within the physical constraints of the site. So the objectives are first economic. The project wants to capitalize on its location. It sits right between key corridors, and planners sees it really as a future business and residential node that could attract investments and jobs. But it also speaks to bridging the socioeconomic divides between affluent northern suburb and the nearby Alexandra Township, which means combining a large portion of bonded and commercial housing aimed at maximizing the surplus value with a little share of state subsidized housing to reduce the risks and remain in the agenda of de-densifying Alex, the original agenda. So how was this translated into the plan? Basically through an iterative process of translating broad development objectives into programmatic goals, and then giving these programmatic goals a form on the abstract space of the plan. It starts from a perimeter following the property boundary drawn on the map. Onto this base, planners layer physical and legal constraints, then sketch a street network, and the remaining land is divided into programmatic units, then into blocks where different typologies are tested. And this process, through this process, one can extrapolate surface areas by land use, which in turn translate into potential real estate or rental income for developers and for Wits University. So throughout the project, negotiations and power relation between the different actors continuously reshaped these objectives, programs, and plans, forcing the design process to look back and recalculate. And here is how these programs are now distributed on the plan. So the first thing you see is a large green area around the Huchzermeyer River. Then industrial activities in brown facing the highway and the community of Buccleuch. Two commercial and offices hubs in red. A high line connecting the Gautrain station towards the center of the development, and a large compound of schools in magenta next to the large green areas. And then in terms of housing, most areas, most of the area is dedicated to 13,000 open market bonded units in orange. In shades of blue, another 13,000 units are either social rental or FLISP, meaning bonded but at a controlled price. And finally, in beige, closer to the Far East Bank, closer to Alex, and the Juxke River, the 3,600 fully subsidized BNG units. And the idea of the phase one, which has kicked off this year, is to start next to Buccleuch with industrial, commercial, and offices areas, as well as some bonded and social rental housing, because starting there requires less upfront investment in terms of infrastructure. And the intention was also to start with some BNG units near Alexandra. But this is now being delayed because the city who owns the piece of land that Nomonde talked about next to Marlborough Drive is delayed with their own development process. And to finish more concretely with the spaces this will result in, I further zoom on the plots. So first to say that the chosen programs, the profitability requirement and the constraints of the site result in a very high housing density on the plots dedicated to housing, with most of the housing between 8 to 12 stories, with only one exception. Here, facing Kelvin, a community who managed to negotiate lower density for bonded housing building to protect their property value. Here you'll notice that the state subsidized housing is set to 8 stories, which is quite different to the norm, but also to what Nomonde showed. This is due obviously to the high density needed to produce sufficient profit margins, but also due to a deal with Kelvin and Buccleuch community against what is considered not proper, meaning the site and service and other forms of incremental and auto construction, which allow impoverished Black people to build as they want. And finally, each of the individual housing blocks are further divided into 4 plots with sole access from a dead-end service road. The reference model for these plots is Fleurhof, another large-scale development in Johannesburg built by the same real estate developer, Calgro M3. Each plot is planned to be gated with access controlled by a boom gate. The main difference from Fleurhof, however, is that here buildings are planned about twice as high as you can see on the what you can see on the picture. So parking will have to be built underground. The design, however, is still being negotiated. So developers and social housing companies are currently debating whether to disperse rather than cluster state subsidized housing. The stated reason is to make management easier, but this also rests on an underlying assumption that poor Black residents need to be surrounded by more affluent role models to maintain order. So I'll stop here, and I hope that the sharp contrast between the spatial imaginaries that I presented and the one that Marie and Nomonde presented will spark interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Quentin. Thank you, everyone. Marie, Nomonde, this was fascinating. So we're now going to turn to our discussants for today. We'll start with Msizi and then...
Sorry, I cannot hear what you're saying almost at all.
No worries. I was saying we're going to have our discussants now. So we're going to start with Msizi and then we'll come to you, Irene.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I'll try and shout as much as I can. Just during the conversation, statement Mari makes that from a participant that we are just managing with what we have kind of stuck with me. And contrasted with that with Nomonde's statement from another participant about the mistrust of anything that is not structural and formed and official. And for me, in between there lies the fault that I think last week I affirmed in the conversation, that lies the a deep mistrust of government by people and of people by government and officials. That's fine. Right. Last week, I briefly kind of rammed in my conversation about my pet irritation, and that is about civil servants and officials in government as part of the problem. And the importance of the participation of communities in all these conversations, for me, is quite a central cog than an option, which we tend to see with government and government projects. And of course, it's driven by problematic things like scorecards and numbers and the political gallery that expects the delivery. One of the things that also irritates me about how we do human settlements is, for instance, how the People's Housing Project program found itself at the bottom of the agenda of government because it didn't deliver these numbers. Yet it, for me, it was one of, I think, when I look at Stjwetla, and I've not been there in a while, as that person who does with what they can manage with is doing so because the politics of waiting are exhausting, and people will take initiative because they have the initiatives, and the failure of the state to come to the party to that energy and provide. I wonder if a provision of a kind of facilitation and a capacitated kind of facility from the state to take the energies of places like Stjwetla who are making do things on their own is a very missing element. So when I look at places like Thailand, and I wonder why, of all these years, and an obvious failure to catch up with what we call a backlog has not kind of galvanized that energy by providing support and letting people who have the willingness and the energy and wanting to do with what they have to be supported. And I want to also looking at it, one of the long time ago, Nomonde Gwebu, when I was a young person, said something, and I was a young person then, but it has never left me. And it was around a funeral. But it is very true about many other things, and I find it instructive for us as officials, professionals, academics, and what it's just that we are sometimes too ready to admit that people are not ready because we are not ready. And I like to add, because we are not brave enough. The first time I left home, I was 20 years old the first time I left my home, and my biggest worry was my mother's cooking. But in 2 weeks of arriving in Maritzburg, I knew my mother was a lousy cook. But because I've never tasted anyone else's food, and I think people do with what they have to do because they really have nothing else to do. And one of the irritations I have is this kind of never pronounced assumption that the expertise of architects, designers, engineers, and scientists in human settlements is really for the preserve of the rich. That public housing doesn't really need these things. And it's something I think we need to galvanize in initiatives like this that Wits has taken up. And I also want to the last time that government had coordinated almost to an acceptable level the delivery of human settlements and projects was at Cosmo. It was not even perfect, but it was how the arrival of services and things that make up for human settlements arrived almost at the same time at Cosmo was a distant, surprising, forgotten moment. And I would love to that this project, as it develops, that it engages in Stjwetla, that it centralizes the experiences of people at Stjwetla from their desperation to their needs to how they see things in combination with what expertise that places like Wits and government could galvanize in creating sustainable human settlement or sustainable neighborhood in Stjwetla. Now, for instance, the guy, I think three sessions ago, the guys from the patrol came in here. So when I look at Lamu, I wonder what would the guys from the patrol think about those narrow corridors. But I think they probably could come up with much more innovative ideas on how Stjwetla can on its own become a human settlement that would not destroy the lives that exist in Stjwetla, but become sustainable. So one of the fights I have with my colleagues, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the city of Johannesburg here, is a cry, for instance, from the guys at PAX, and how they are hardly ever consulted in the projects by the Human Settlements Department as in terms of where would these green spaces be until very last at the end. It is such things I would love to see as a Stjwetla that is developing its trajectory and development with a relationship in its site on how it was going to relate to Jaske River and how Alex is going to relate to Jaske River and become a settlement that we do not have to remove or displace. And one last thing I want to also look at as wish to be looked at as we look for alternatives in Stjwetla is that we built what we call the walk-ups. Government has built what we call the walk-ups, which is RDP house with floors up. And we never even paused to think about how those things are going to be managed. I would love to look at, to begin to think about occupying the space at Stjwetla with the people part of the decision-making and how the environments that, if they are densified, and how are they going to be managed, as opposed to our top-down management and initiations of projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Irene. Just give me 2 seconds. I just want to switch off this mic and change to the screen. Give me a second. I'll give you a thumbs up when we're ready.
Funniest thing that I found about Alex is how Alex has not actually put pressure on government on expropriation. And waited for all these processes down to the areas that exist around Alex, when Alex doesn't have spaces in itself. I would love to see an Alex that not only goes to the street for water and what, but to go to the street about the expropriation of land around Alex that are underutilized.
Thank you, Msizi. Irene?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased to listen to all the presentations and even the comments. Really to the point. I think some of them are the ones that I thought to talk about a little bit about. And well, of course, I am coming from a double, I would say, different context. One is which I, find myself right now in the Swedish case or the Scandinavian case of planning. And the other one is my past in the context of the Latin American cities planning. Well, you cannot talk about Latin American as one model, as it would be as wrong as to talk about the African model. But in one sense, I mean, I think these presentations have brought me to both these experiences and knowledge, both historically, but also very much spatially and socially, of course. And I would say I have actually picked up four aspects from the presentation. I had actually a very short own presentation, which is touching upon several of these points, but I think for saving time, I will only refer to my notes here. And one is that of all these programs, including the experiences and the commonalities with, or the similarities with the Scandinavian case, which is, as you probably know, it's a totally different context. I mean, when we're planning at least in the 70s and 60s, it was a kind of exemplary case of planning with a welfare, kind of a commitment behind it. And everything that was actually associated with the good planning. I mean, the human, socially aware planning, and so on and so forth. And you actually find all these elements acting, I mean, actively in the city, the production of urban space today. But studies have been, very much critical the last, I would say, decades, and have more or less understood two things about this planning. One is exactly what, sorry, I didn't catch the name of the former talk of the previous commentator, and if you give it to me, I would be more comfortable.
Msizi.
Msizi. Okay.
Msizi.
Is that okay? Divi.
Yes.
Okay.
Msizi. I'll put it in the chat so you
Okay,
can see.
thank you. Yeah, that would be nice. And sorry for that, though. So I didn't catch the name, but thank you so much for those comments, because I think they were really, really good, and I agree with all of them. So one of the things was this of top-down planning. It was still, even if it was welfare based, even if it was, kind of, directed to at least try to even the social socioeconomic differences or class differences in society. But anyhow, it was so extremely top-down and colonial, I would say, doing a very much colonial planning. And the effects of those two aspects have been in the second thing that I was reflecting, seeing all these cases that were presented, that instead of counteracting segregation, and I'm talking about both socioeconomic and racial segregation, but even gender segregation, the genderized patterns in the uneven city, they were actually, by the contrary, cementing segregation. So I think I see these also in these cases in which I reacted a little bit when Mary talked about there is no internal socioeconomic segregation in one of the areas that you were studying, Mary. But I mean, of course, I understand that you are also, starting from the pre-knowledge on that the cities in general are very, very much segregated. So even if it's not the new pattern of segregation patterns in the city as a whole are being cemented. So that is the second thing. And the third thing, and I think it was also touched upon in several senses here, is that of the economic profit, the profit that it is taking in each of these models. And that is also something that I've seen, and I'm myself also participating in this critical analysis of what planning actually is, how it is carried out I mean, it has been the last, I don't know, in the case of Sweden, is last 70 years. While in the case of most Latin American cities, it's more, probably 60 or 50 years. But in a way, I mean, all the different models and I would say political and ideological approaches to planning all have been doing the same, which is still warranting and protecting the private sector's possibility of drawing profit. I mean, either as the property rights or I mean not only the buildings, but also not only the built environment, but also the land, as you were touching upon as well before, and but also economic profit, which we have seen in Sweden a lot. I mean, being also criticizing from more radical thinking on planning and housing, the profit based on the system of subsidies, because the system of subsidies have been favoring and making even more easy for the private sector to gain a lot of money, to just make a lot of profit from this so-called social housing. So I'm also thinking about the absolute necessity of having states that are much more active and take much more the responsibility for not only relying on the private sector for organizing the housing provision in an extremely uneven, socially and socioeconomically uneven society, I mean also a racially uneven society, and even patriarchal society. So I would say that we shouldn't stop claiming, I mean, that the role of the state is so central, and it has been so marginal in almost all the cases we know about planning in the colonial city, but also, as Mary said, in the post-colonial city. So yeah, thank you very much for this. I mean, that's what I think I can say in the time left, but I don't know if there will be any other comments now, probably from other people. But thank you so much for this presentation. I really would like to have more time for discussing this, because I mean, I think it is in the similarities, not only in the differences, that we can find very, relevant knowledge to, I mean, to produce a kind of accumulated knowledge on this, that it is also, it's local and global at the same time. So a local and accumulation of knowledge, I think. So thank you very much. This has been a fantastic opportunity for me to just to reflect, more in those terms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. With the 5 minutes we have left, I'm going to ask folks in the chat, please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. But I see, Sarah, you have a question. Would you be able to unmute yourself and maybe ask the question directly?
Hi, Stjwetla. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. Yes, I think it's not necessarily centrally on what's being discussed this afternoon, my question, but it does relate to what was being presented around the plans that Calgro M3 have for Frankenwald or Bankenwald. So I was just making the comment that the 4-story walk-up B&G flats in Vleurhof do have significant problems from the perspective of the post-occupancy management of the buildings, because no plans were put in place for that management, no body corporates, and also how the funding of that might happen, how the funding of things like maintenance and management might happen through levies, etc. And so with the 8-story model that's being proposed for Calgro by Calgro M3 in Frankenwald, the same kinds of issues are going to arise. And I just wondered if there was now clarity on how that kind of thing is going to happen. It's the issue that arises from that particular built form of giveaway housing. That particular built form requires management long-term of the common spaces, of the corridors and flats, and etc. And I presume the 8-story buildings are going to have lifts as well. And so, yeah, there are multiple other issues, I think, with that particular built form for very low-income people, to do with how home-based income generation happens, etc., etc. But I just wondered if there was anything that Quentin or maybe Msizi, hi Msizi, might be able to say about that particular issue. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Sarah, yeah, go ahead, Quentin, and then Nomonde can go after you. I see she has a hand.
Yeah, thank you. The paradox, I think, with Frankenwald is that it looks quite advanced and construction has already started, but it's so big that actually they didn't have to go so far in the conception on the whole program. So now they are starting the phase 1, and the phase 1 as it is now, I mean, does not yet contain state subsidized housing. So they are only now currently negotiating, starting to work together with the social housing company on these questions of management as well. I know from my interview that it's they didn't yet land on a final solution, but that this is ongoing work. So I cannot answer the. I think there is not yet a solution found. the idea, nevertheless, behind building 8 stories was to say that and also to put them closer to other type of housing, to not cluster them all together, was to try also to avoid so in that's what they say, this management problem to cluster together, but to split them, you know, around the site, to minimize them, or so that maybe next to a wealthier compound, there could be some sort of perequation or a transfer of knowledge on how to manage on the other side, etc. But I think they didn't yet find a final solution.
Thank you, Quentin. Nomonde?
Thank you very much. Thanks for raising that. I bumped into this a lot in my research, just something that I couldn't get to here. But you know, I'll just use an example. The Johannesburg Housing Company in Newtown, those Pumlani Gardens and the kind of brickfields development that was done by Savage and Dodd, also in its concept phase was for was for a low income earner. But now when you look at the price of what's being rented, it misses that market completely. And I know it sounds quite pessimistic, but I think when I look at other examples of where exactly what you're saying, the management company issue is not thought through, it seems a bit convenient, because what I think will happen because of some of the other examples I stumbled on is that, you know, you sort of agree, instead of having the argument now. What Quentin is saying, that they get to start because it's such a huge development. There isn't like a plan of a unit for everything yet. So, you know, you sort of agree in negotiations, and then the management company sort of comes as a surprise. And then that surprise increases the cost. The increased cost gets you the slightly upper middle income market that you wanted in the first place. So you kind of win by not not calculating that upfront, knowing that you'll need it later. So that's what I've observed in a couple of other examples that were intended for low income earners, but ended up not being because of that reason. And that's why I just sort of took what looked like quite a pessimistic view and said, it's likely or possible, let's say, for that kind of thing to play out here.
Thank you both for those reflections and insights. I'm not sure if there are other, we'll go on until about 35 minutes past 5. I'm not sure if there's anyone else who has any questions or points that you'd like to raise in the room, or online.
I think just one other thing is that, I mean, inherent in this multi-story buildings, this is the fight I've had with colleagues in work. The moment you say people will earn between 0 and 2,500 rand when you believe in these houses, inherent in that is that there's going to be a subsidy. We have to find where it comes from, whether it's going to be a cross subsidy from the rich to them. You can't turn around afterwards. After you've allocated houses to people who earn 0 to 2,500 and say, oh, by the way, there's a management fee. It's not a lie. And we're trying to retrofit that problem by trying to introduce these fees afterwards. And try one politician to go and tell people that you ought to find one.
Marie, you based on the same kind of. Great.
On this question of managing once you start looking at it from that perspective, what you're doing is you're putting people up in 8 floors, which is not a necessarily very comfortable way of living. You have to navigate on a daily basis, lifts or staircases, long corridors, which ends up, I think one then needs to start analyzing these Zitoba kind of passageways, which probably are 200 meters long, it's like longest iteration to get from A to B. And we walked past often and we were told that's the densest part and we've never been inside. And when we finally did a transect walk into that area, I was really quite surprised at the way people had arranged things and were managing these spaces and navigating, and how refuse was being collected in little bags, hung up, kind of a system that just is managed somehow, organized. It falls apart in the interface with the municipality, and I'm speaking here on behalf of my student, Khuhlane Sabana is doing a research on this and found, and the city solution, pick it up solution was everybody's got to just dump in a big pile on the edge of the settlement, and that's where they collect, but that's where the rats are, and that's where the problems, the refuse problems start. Not inside the settlement where everyone's very neatly kind of picking up there and keeping their things. And same with sanitation and the way things are being solved. If you think about someone like that having to adjust, living in an 8th floor house, where the person downstairs might not be kind of cooperating well and being loud, or, all sorts of things would have to be navigated and arranged collectively ultimately. And it's density is density, whether you stack it on top of one another or whether it's arranged. And I'd like to say that arranged through narrow passages is not necessarily the worst way in living in density. But I think that's also up for debate, and obviously people living in these spaces should be participating in those debates. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to read the comment and kind of ties quite nicely to what we've just been talking about to end, and that's from Kagwa Saddam, who says, I think we need to also capitalize on people's ways of living in the provision of public housing and other services, as opposed to the narrative that the urban poor live for the sake of living. So thank you, Kagwa, and thank you to everyone who has added their insight. It always feels like we never have enough time. But I hope that the conversations, as all of you have started these conversations and all of your presentations, were really invoking some fascinating themes and insights that obviously are applicable across academia, across practice, with those of us living in spaces and experiencing them and building them with our own hands. So thank you to everyone who's here today in the room and online. I'm just going to give a final punt to our event that we're having next week. So on the 28th of October, Tuesday, the last event, you can say, in this series that we've been running is the City Forum exhibition. I'm not sure, Kumo, if you can share the flyer for us so that folks can see it, but our opening and public program will be on Tuesday, the 28th of October from 1 until 6:30 p.m. The venue is the Industrial Warehouse in Northway, corner Industrial Warehouse Northway, corner Marlborough Drive in Frankenwald. I know our students and many staff have been hard at work converting that space, so we're really looking forward to it. We have a packed program from 1 until around 5:15. Panels that are going to be there. We're having a screening of the documentary. Our photo voice stories are going to be on display. And also all of the projects and engagements that students and partnerships between staff and residents that have been ongoing are going to be on display there. So please do come and join us if you can. And thank you again to everyone who's in the room and online today. We appreciate your presence and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.